Mrs. Killer. Alan stepped out of his car, the moonlight casting an eerie glow on the grand mansion before him. It stood tall and imposing against the midnight sky, a hulking silhouette with shadows creeping across its cracked facade. The air was thick with the scent of rain and damp earth, and the gravel crunched under his boots as he approached the heavy wooden door. A chill ran down his spine, not just from the cold, but from the ominous feeling that hung in the air like a heavy shroud. Something was definitely wrong here. Alan took a deep breath, adjusted the collar of his coat, and pushed open the creaking door. It groaned in protest, revealing a dimly lit hallway lined with old paintings, their frames thick with dust. The air inside was musty, tinged with the metallic scent of something he couldn't quite place, something that sent his instincts into overdrive. "Anyone here?" Alan called out, his voice echoing through the cavernous entryway. But only silence answered him, a silence so profound it seemed to swallow his words whole. Drawing his flashlight, he walked cautiously down the hall, his eyes scanning for any signs of movement. He reached a closed door at the end of the corridor, and as he turned the knob, he heard faint voices coming from within. He pushed the door open, stepping into a room dimly illuminated by a flickering chandelier. The sight before him made him stop in his tracks. The room was a mess. Broken glass scattered across the marble floor, and heavy drapes hung askew from their rods. But what drew Alan's gaze most sharply were the bodies. 2 men lay lifeless on the floor, their eyes wide open, staring blankly into nothingness. Blood pooled around their heads, seeping into the cracks between the tiles. "Inspector Allen, over here," a voice called out, startling him from his shock. The voice belonged to Dr. Sam, the chief medical examiner, who was crouched beside one of the bodies. His eyes were dark with a mix of exhaustion and something Alan couldn't quite place. Was it fear? Guilt? Alan's eyes quickly took in the other figures in the room. 3 more people stood near the back, looking tense and uncomfortable. A woman with pale skin and red hair clutching her shawl tightly around her shoulders, a young man with glasses whose hands trembled, and a burly older gentleman with a stern expression, his fists clenched at his sides. Each of them looked at Alan with a mix of relief and trepidation, as if his arrival had changed everything, and yet nothing at all. What the hell happened here? Alan demanded, directing his question at Dr. Sam, who stood up slowly, wiping his hands on a blood-stained cloth. The doctor's face was pale, beads of sweat glistening on his forehead despite the chilly air. "We found him like this," Dr. Sam said, his voice low and steady. "I received a call not long before you arrived. Came straight here to assess the situation." Alan stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. 2 dead men, and 4 of you still breathing. That's quite the scene." He pointed his flashlight at the faces of the 4 survivors one by one, gauging their reactions. "So, who called the police?" The young man with glasses, who looked no older than his mid-20s, raised a shaky hand. "I did," he stammered, swallowing hard. "I'm Henry Walters. I heard," he paused, glancing nervously at the others. "I heard screams. I came downstairs and found this." Alan's eyes lingered on Henry for a moment longer than necessary, watching the way his hands twisted together, fingers fidgeting. Fear, perhaps, or something more. He stored that observation away for later. "And who are the deceased?" Alan asked, turning to Dr. Sam. Dr. Sam gestured to the bodies. "The one closest to the door is Roger Clemens, the butler of this mansion. The other is Mr. Lyle Peterson, a guest here tonight." "Guests?" Alan raised an eyebrow. What kind of gathering is this at such an ungodly hour? The red-haired woman, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke up, her voice trembling. It was supposed to be a business meeting. "My name is Eleanor Carlyle. Mr. Peterson was a business associate of my late husband." Alan noted how her hands clutched the shawl tighter around her, as if trying to shield herself from more than just a cold. A business meeting at midnight? Alan's tone was skeptical. What sort of business could possibly warrant such an hour? Eleanor's eyes flickered toward the older gentleman standing beside her, who cleared his throat. "We were discussing a sensitive matter," he said gruffly. "My name is Charles Fitzgerald. The nature of our business is none of your concern, Inspector." Alan's jaw clenched, but he let it slide for now. There was something these people weren't telling him. But he knew that pressing too hard too soon would only make them clam up tighter. Instead, he turned his attention back to the bodies. Kneeling beside Roger Clemens, Alan examined the butler's stiff, lifeless face. No visible wounds beyond the blood around his head, but the man's eyes were frozen in an expression of sheer terror. The same was true for Mr. Peterson. Alan leaned closer, catching a faint whiff of something acrid, like chemicals. "Dr. Sam," Alan called over his shoulder. "Any initial thoughts on the cause of death?" Dr. Sam shook his head, his brow furrowed. "I can't confirm anything yet, but I suspect poison. There are no obvious signs of struggle or external trauma. The way their muscles are locked, it could be a fast-acting toxin." Alan nodded slowly, piecing together the fragments of the scene in his mind. He turned to the others, fixing them with a steely gaze. "Let's be clear. 2 men are dead, and none of you are leaving this mansion until I get some answers." His voice was calm but firm, a warning that there would be no easy escape from this. Eleanor let out a small gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. Henry Walters seemed on the verge of tears, while Charles Fitzgerald's expression turned even more sour. Alan could see the tension rising in the room like the tide coming in. There was a storm brewing here, and he was right in the middle of it. But then, a soft creak echoed from the dark hallway outside, followed by the faintest whisper of footsteps. Alan's head snapped toward the door, his instincts flaring. "Did anyone else arrive after you?" he asked, his voice now low, his eyes fixed on the door. The 4 remaining guests exchanged confused glances, shaking their heads. "I'll be right back," Alan muttered, stepping out of the room, leaving the others behind. As he moved through the dimly lit hall, the sound of footsteps quickened as if someone or something was trying to escape. Alan moved back into the room, his flashlight casting long, wavering shadows across the faces of the 4 remaining people. The uneasy silence returned as he stood by the 2 corpses, scrutinizing them with a sharp, practiced eye. The previous assumption of poisoning, it seemed, was about to be tossed out the window. Turning to Dr. Sam, Alan's voice was cold and steady. "You mentioned poison earlier, but I think we both know that's not the case." He gestured to the 2 lifeless bodies sprawled on the floor. "What about these markings? And the gunshot wounds? How did you miss those?" Dr. Sam stiffened, the creases on his forehead deepening. I arrived only a few minutes before you, Inspector. I hadn't gotten to examine them fully." He pulled off his gloves with a snap, the latex clinging to his sweaty fingers. "But you're right. There's something here that I hadn't noticed at first." Alan knelt beside the body of Mr. Smith, whose face was twisted in an expression of shock. A dark, round hole was drilled neatly into the center of his forehead, the dried blood around it forming a grotesque halo. But what drew Alan's attention was the odd symbol carved into the man's skin, just above the wound, a triangle with a strange, snake-like line cutting through it. "What is this?" Alan muttered, more to himself than anyone else. He reached for his notepad, sketching the symbol quickly, his brows furrowed in concentration. "And Hardy's got one, too." He shifted over to William Hardy's body, which lay a few feet away, sprawled on its back like a discarded doll. Sure enough, the same mark was etched onto his forehead, right above another precise bullet hole. As Alan straightened up, he turned to face the room's surviving occupants. "I need answers, and I need them now. What do these marks mean? And why were these men executed like this?" Charles Fitzgerald, the older gentleman, took a step forward, his eyes narrowing as he examined the bodies. "I've never seen anything like it," he said gruffly, though there was a slight tremor in his voice that didn't go unnoticed. It looks like some kind of ritual marking, but I assure you, Inspector, I have no idea what any of this is about. You expect me to believe that? Alan shot back. 2 men are dead, and the 4 of you are conveniently the only witnesses. I find it hard to swallow that none of you have any idea what's going on. The young man, Henry Walters, let out a shaky breath and adjusted his glasses. I swear, I don't know anything, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I was in my room when I heard the shots. By the time I got down here, they were already dead. Liar, Eleanor Carlyle hissed, her voice laced with venom. Her eyes, usually soft and expressive, were now cold and hard. I saw you coming out of this very room minutes before the inspector arrived. What were you doing in here, Henry? Henry's face went as pale as the moonlight filtering through the dusty windows. And no, that's not true, he stammered, backing up a step. I heard the shots and came down to see what had happened. I wouldn't. Enough, Alan barked, silencing the room. I'm not interested in your petty accusations. If you all keep pointing fingers at each other, we'll never get to the truth. He turned back to Dr. Sam, who was now busy examining the bodies more closely. Doctor, do you have anything else to add? Are these gunshots recent? Dr. Sam nodded grimly. Yes, within the last hour, I'd say. The skin around the entry wounds is still taut, and the blood hasn't fully congealed. But these markings, that's beyond my expertise. This is something deliberate, premeditated. Alan's mind raced. A ritualistic killing? The precision of the gunshots, combined with the strange symbols, didn't match the profile of a spur-of-the-moment murder. These were cold executions, done with a chilling level of control. You said it was a business meeting, Eleanor, Alan said, turning toward her. But I'm having a hard time believing that business associates get shot and marked like cattle during negotiations. What's really going on here? Eleanor's face crumpled, her composure finally breaking. She reached for her shawl, clutching it tightly as though it could protect her from the truth she was trying to avoid. It wasn't supposed to be like this, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mr. Hardy and Mr. Smith, they were discussing something important with Charles and me. We didn't expect it to turn violent. Alan's eyes narrowed. What were you discussing? What's worth killing 2 men over? Before she could answer, the door behind them creaked open again, and everyone's head snapped toward it. A chill wind swept into the room, rustling the papers strewn across a nearby table. The chandelier flickered, casting ghostly shadows across the walls. Alan drew his gun, instincts on high alert. Who's there? He called out, his voice a low growl. Show yourself. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind whistling through the cracked windows. Then, a figure stepped into the dim light. A man dressed in dark clothes, his face partially obscured by the brim of a hat. He moved with a slow, deliberate gait, as if he had all the time in the world. Who the hell are you? Alan demanded, aiming his gun squarely at the intruder. The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked past Alan, his gaze settling on the bodies with a hint of amusement. Ah, he finally said, his voice smooth as silk. I see my handiwork has caused quite the stir. A collective gasp filled the room. Eleanor stumbled back, nearly collapsing against the wall. Henry's face went ghostly white, while Charles took an instinctive step forward as if preparing to attack. What do you mean, your handiwork? Alan asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. The man chuckled softly, a sound that sent shivers down Alan's spine. Oh, don't play coy, Inspector. These men were marked for death long before they set foot in this mansion. They were involved in matters far beyond your understanding. He gestured lazily toward the corpses, his smile never reaching his cold, dead eyes. Alan tightened his grip on his gun, his mind racing. You're under arrest, he said through gritted teeth. Hands where I can see them. But the man merely tilted his head, the dim light catching the glint of something metallic in his hand, a small, intricate device that looked far too modern for the setting. "You can try, Inspector," he said with a sinister grin, "but I doubt you'll like what happens next." Before Alan could react, there was a flash of light, and the room was plunged into chaos. Dr. Sam let out a long breath as he stood up from examining the bodies, wiping the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. The grim look on his face deepened the lines that creased his weathered features. Alan, who had been watching him intently, folded his arms, waiting for the medical examiner to finally speak. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife, and the 4 remaining people in the room were visibly on edge. Dr. Sam turned to face Alan, his eyes dark with something that bordered on resignation. "Inspector," he began, his voice steady but quiet, "I confirmed it. Both Mr. Smith and Mr. Hardy died from gunshot wounds. The shots were fired at close range." Alan arched an eyebrow, tilting his head slightly. "And the marks on their foreheads? What about those?" "Unrelated to the cause of death, from what I can tell. Those symbols were carved post-mortem," Dr. Sam replied, shaking his head slowly. "There's no fresh bleeding around the markings. They were added after they were already dead." "Lovely," Alan muttered under his breath. "So we've got someone playing with bodies like they're art projects." Dr. Sam cleared his throat, shifting his weight uncomfortably. "Inspector, there's more. I've also found evidence on the murder weapon that complicates things." Alan's eyes narrowed. "Go on." Dr. Sam hesitated, casting a glance at the others who were still huddled in the far corner of the room, eyes wide and fearful. "Given the placement of the shots and the angle, I initially thought this was an execution, 2 cold-blooded murders. But after examining the bodies more closely, I suspect it may have been a murder-suicide." "A murder-suicide?" Alan echoed, disbelief lacing his tone. The room seemed to hold its breath, the tension thickening like a gathering storm. "And what exactly makes you think that?" "The trajectory of the bullet wounds," Dr. Sam explained, gesturing to the corpses. "Mr. Hardy was shot first. The angle of the wound suggests the shooter was standing above him, close enough that there's powder residue on his skin. Mr. Smith's wound, on the other hand, was self-inflicted. The angle is consistent with a gun held to his own forehead." Alan let the information sink in, turning it over in his mind like a puzzle piece that just didn't seem to fit. "And yet," he said slowly, "you're still not convinced, are you?" Dr. Sam shook his head, his gaze distant. "The whole scene feels staged. It's too perfect, too clean. And there's the fact that both victims have matching symbols on their foreheads. If this were truly a spur-of-the-moment murder-suicide, why take the time to carve those symbols after the fact?" Alan nodded thoughtfully. The symbols were a glaring inconsistency, one that gnawed at the edges of his thoughts like a persistent itch. Something about this whole situation was wrong, and it was his job to unravel it before it unraveled them all. Just then, there was a sharp knock on the door, and one of Alan's officers, Detective Rivera, entered, holding a clear evidence bag. Inside was a sleek, black revolver that gleamed under the dim chandelier light. "Inspector," Rivera said, stepping forward, "we found this in the next room, hidden under a chair." "Is that the murder weapon?" Alan asked, eyeing the revolver. Rivera nodded. "It matches the caliber of the bullets that killed both victims. And here's the kicker. Both Smith's and Hardy's fingerprints are on it." "Both of their fingerprints?" Alan's voice was a mix of disbelief and frustration. He glanced at Dr. Sam, whose frown deepened. "So, let me get this straight. We've got 2 dead men, each shot in the head, both of their prints on the gun, and markings carved on their foreheads after they were already dead? Is someone trying to set a new record for confusing crime scenes?" Rivera shrugged, a thin smile playing on her lips despite the grimness of the situation. "Looks that way, boss. Either they took turns shooting each other, or someone's going to great lengths to muddy the waters." Alan approached the evidence bag, studying the gun with a careful eye. The weight of it seemed to press down on him, as if it carried all the answers he needed but refused to give them up. He turned back to the remaining guests, who had been listening intently, their expressions a mix of fear and suspicion. "So," Alan said, raising his voice to capture everyone's attention, "how do the two of you explain your fingerprints on this gun, if it was a murder-suicide?" He focused his gaze on Henry and Eleanor, whose faces had gone pale. "I've never seen that gun before in my life," Henry blurted out, his voice cracking with panic. He was practically shaking now, his eyes darting from Alan to Dr. Sam and back again. "I swear, Inspector, I didn't touch it. I don't even know how my fingerprints could be on it. And what about you, Miss Carlyle?" Alan turned to Eleanor, whose face had grown stony, her previous fear replaced by a mask of cold composure. "I have nothing to say," Eleanor replied, her voice clipped. "Whatever game you think you're playing, Inspector, I assure you I had nothing to do with it." Alan could feel the pressure building in his chest as he tried to make sense of the twisted web unraveling before him. Both Henry and Eleanor seemed genuine enough in their denials, but someone was lying. Someone had to be. "Let's not dance around it," Alan said sharply. "Fingerprints don't lie. So either you touched that gun, or someone planted your prints on it. And right now, neither of those options looks good for either of you." Charles Fitzgerald, who had been silent up until now, let out a low growl of frustration. "Inspector," he barked, "do you really think this is some kind of parlor game? We're as much in the dark as you are. Those two men are dead, and I assure you, none of us had any reason to harm them. You expect me to believe that?" Alan shot back, stepping closer. "Two men are dead. Both your fingerprints are on the gun. And yet all of you have been dancing around the truth since I got here. What's really going on? What were you all discussing before these two ended up with bullets in their skulls?" Before anyone could respond, the lights in the room flickered, and a sudden crash echoed from somewhere deep in the mansion. The sound was like a cannon blast in the silence, sending everyone's nerves to the edge. Alan's hand instinctively went to the holster at his side, drawing his gun. "Rivera, with me," he ordered, motioning toward the darkened corridor. "Everyone else, stay put." Dr. Sam's eyes widened as he looked toward the shadows beyond the door. "What was that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Maybe another guest you forgot to mention," Alan muttered grimly before disappearing into the darkness with Rivera. The four remaining figures in the room exchanged wary glances, the tension tightening like a noose around their throats. Eleanor clutched her shawl tighter. Henry's hand shook uncontrollably, and even Charles seemed unsettled. His usual bluster faded. As the sound of Alan's and Rivera's footsteps faded into the depths of the mansion, the others were left in uneasy silence, knowing that whatever secrets lay hidden in these walls were about to surface, whether they were ready for them or not. Sub-Inspector Fred leaned against the heavy oak doorframe, the dim lighting casting harsh shadows over his worn features. His expression was one of grim satisfaction, tinged with a touch of exhaustion. He had just returned from the forensics van parked outside the mansion, where the latest batch of evidence had been analyzed. The sound of his boots clicking on the polished floor echoed as he approached Alan, who stood near the fireplace, scrutinizing his notes. "Inspector," Fred called out, his voice low but steady. Alan turned, his intense gaze sharpening as Fred held up a small evidence bag containing swabs and test results. "Got something that'll twist this case up even more." Alan crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing. "Oh, what now, Fred?" Fred stepped closer, lowering his voice as though the walls themselves had ears. Both Mr. Smith and William Hardy had traces of gunpowder residue on their hands. The room seemed to freeze for a moment, and the tension, already simmering, threatened to boil over. Alan's brow furrowed as he processed this new information. He was silent for a beat longer than usual, his mind racing to connect the dots that stubbornly refused to align. Gunpowder residue on both their hands? Alan repeated, his tone skeptical yet intrigued. He ran a hand through his hair, his sharp eyes locking onto Fred. "You're sure about this? No chance of contamination?" Fred gave a curt nod. "I double-checked it myself, Inspector. Both men definitely fired a weapon recently. The residue levels are consistent with having discharged the revolver we found. But here's the kicker. The amount of residue on Hardy's hands is much lighter than on Smith's. So, what are you suggesting? Alan pressed, glancing over his shoulder toward the room where the bodies lay. Hardy fires a shot. Smith wrestles the gun away, and then what? Shoots Hardy and himself. Fred shrugged, the lines on his face deepening as he considered the implications. It's one possibility, but if that's the case, why are the bodies positioned so strangely? And why the symbols carved into their foreheads? He glanced warily at the others in the room, who were pretending not to eavesdrop, but were clearly hanging on to every word. Inspector, Dr. Sam interjected, stepping forward. If both men had gunpowder residue, it complicates the murder-suicide theory. Smith might have fired first, then Hardy tried to defend himself, but it's still strange. These are execution-style shots. Both men were shot in the head, point-blank. That doesn't fit the pattern of a struggle. Alan nodded slowly, rubbing the stubble on his chin as he mulled over the conflicting evidence. The four remaining guests, Charles, Eleanor, Henry, and the silent maid, Clara, watched with tense anticipation. Alan could almost feel their nerves vibrating like over-tightened strings, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. He turned back to Fred. Anything else? Did you get prints from anywhere else on the weapon? Negative, Fred replied, shaking his head. Aside from the victims, the revolver was clean. No other prints. He paused, then added, but I did find smudges that suggest someone wiped it down before hiding it under that chair. That's not exactly the work of someone in the middle of a murder-suicide, Alan muttered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He turned sharply to the room's occupants. Looks like someone's been busy cleaning up after themselves. Eleanor Carlyle, who had been wringing her hands nervously, suddenly looked up, her face pale. Inspector, I swear none of us touched that gun, she insisted, her voice quavering. You have to believe me. Belief doesn't factor into this, Miss Carlyle, Alan said coldly. Evidence does. He turned his gaze to Henry, who had been conspicuously quiet since Fred had entered the room. Henry adjusted his glasses, his fingers trembling slightly. I don't know what's going on here, but if they both had residue on their hands, maybe they were trying to kill each other. Maybe things just got out of hand. That's one theory, Alan said, his voice heavy with skepticism. But it doesn't explain why the bodies were found like they were, or why someone felt the need to carve those symbols on their foreheads. And if it was a struggle between the two of them, why were the rest of you conveniently nearby when I arrived? A tense silence followed Alan's words, broken only by the distant sound of rain tapping against the window panes. The wind howled outside, making the ancient mansion creak and groan like an old ship adrift in a storm. It was as if the very house was protesting the secrets being dragged into the open. Dr. Sam broke the silence with a thoughtful murmur. Inspector, given the evidence, it's almost like someone staged this entire scene to look like a murder-suicide. Alan's gaze snapped back to Dr. Sam, the pieces of the puzzle still refusing to fit. Staged? But why? Charles Fitzgerald, who had been pacing in the corner, finally stepped forward. His face was flushed with frustration, and his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. Look, he growled, I've had enough of this. Are you implying one of us orchestrated this whole bloody mess? Because if that's the case, you're barking up the wrong tree. Smith and Hardy were business partners. Why the hell would any of us want them dead? You tell me, Alan said, eyes boring into Charles. Maybe their business dealings weren't as straightforward as you're making them out to be. People kill for a lot less than money, especially when secrets are involved. Eleanor let out a small, stifled sob, her hands trembling as she clutched her shawl. You have to understand, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Smith and Mr. Hardy were arguing before they were killed. Something about a deal going wrong. But I didn't think it would come to this. What deal? Alan demanded, stepping closer to her. What exactly were they arguing about? Before Eleanor could answer, The door to the study burst open, and another officer rushed in, his face pale. "Inspector, we found something in the West Wing." Alan's eyes flashed with renewed urgency. "What is it?" "A hidden compartment, sir," the officer said, catching his breath. "There's blood and something else. Symbols, just like the ones carved on the victims." The room fell into a stunned silence. Alan's mind whirred like a well-oiled machine, piecing together this latest revelation. If there was blood in a hidden compartment, this was no simple case of murder-suicide. This was something darker, something that reached far beyond a business dispute gone wrong. Alan turned to Fred, his jaw set. "Secure the scene and get forensics in there immediately. I want every inch of that compartment examined." Fred nodded, already heading for the door, his expression grim. Alan turned back to the room's remaining occupants, his eyes flickering between their frightened faces. He could almost taste the fear radiating from them, mingled with something else, something that smelled suspiciously like guilt. "Seems like there's a lot more to this story than you're all letting on," Alan said, his voice low and dangerous. "And I will find out what it is. The question is, who's going to crack first?" As the room settled into an uneasy silence once more, Alan knew one thing for sure. They were far from unraveling the twisted threads of this mystery. Alan leaned against the grand mahogany desk, the flickering glow from the antique chandelier casting deep shadows across his face. The room was growing colder by the minute, as if the very walls were absorbing the tension that hung thick in the air. He was deep in thought, piecing together the fragments of this case, but there was one name that kept gnawing at the back of his mind like an unhealed wound. Big Boss. Alan clenched his jaw, his fists tightening involuntarily. He knew his old rival all too well. If Big Boss had his fingers in this pie, then things were about to get messy. The man had made a career out of sabotage and playing mind games, particularly with Alan. The last time their paths had crossed, it had nearly cost Alan his badge. Now, the thought that Big Boss could be involved in this twisted affair brought a wave of both dread and grim determination. Alan was not about to let him win this time. As Alan's mind churned, the door creaked open, and Joseph Hardy strode into the room. The young man's eyes were red-rimmed, his face a mask of grief and fury. He had the look of someone who had been running on adrenaline for far too long, a ticking time bomb just waiting to go off. "Inspector," Joseph said, his voice hoarse as if he had been shouting or crying, maybe both. "I need to speak with you. Now." Alan raised an eyebrow, gesturing to one of the leather chairs in front of the desk. "Take a seat, Joseph. Let's hear it." Joseph shook his head, ignoring the invitation. He was too agitated to sit, instead pacing back and forth like a caged animal. "My father. He was innocent," Joseph said, his voice cracking. "This whole thing, it's all Smith's fault. That bastard ruined him." "Slow down," Alan said firmly, trying to rein in the young man's spiraling emotions. "What do you mean Smith ruined him? Start from the beginning." Joseph stopped in his tracks, running a hand through his disheveled hair. He looked like he was on the edge of a breakdown, but there was a fire in his eyes, one fueled by rage rather than despair. "Smith and my father were business partners, yes, but it wasn't an equal partnership. Smith, he bled my father dry, promised him investments that would save his company, but they were all lies, scams to line his own pockets." Alan's eyes narrowed. "If that's true, why didn't your father go to the authorities?" "Because he trusted him." Joseph spat, his voice shaking with barely controlled anger. "Smith convinced him that if he just waited a little longer, everything would turn around. But it never did. My father was too proud to admit he'd been duped. He was a good man, Inspector. He believed Smith was his friend." The pain in Joseph's voice was raw, cutting through the air like a knife. Alan had seen this kind of betrayal before, the kind that turned decent men into desperate ones. "So you're saying Smith drove your father to ruin. But that doesn't explain why they ended up dead here together," Alan said, keeping his tone neutral, though he was already recalculating his theories. Joseph's hands were trembling now, and he shoved them into his pockets as if to hide his weakness. "I don't know what they were doing here," he admitted, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But whatever it was Smith who dragged my father into it. Maybe my father came here to confront him, maybe to get back what was his." Alan's gaze softened slightly as he watched the young man struggle with his emotions. "You're saying your father didn't come here with the intention of violence?" Joseph's eyes flickered, and for a moment he looked away. I don't know. My father was desperate. The debts were piling up. The banks were on his back. He was losing everything. But he wasn't a killer, Inspector. He didn't have it in him." Alan studied Joseph's face, searching for any sign of deception. There was something in the young man's eyes that spoke of truth, or at least a desperate desire for it to be true. But Alan had been in this game too long to take anything at face value, especially with the shadow of Big Boss looming over this case like a specter. "Joseph, I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to be honest," Alan said, leaning forward slightly. "Have you had any contact with someone who goes by the name Big Boss?" Joseph's head snapped up, a flicker of confusion crossing his features. "Big Boss? I've heard the name before, but I don't know him. My father mentioned him once, said he was a businessman with connections, but I didn't think he was involved in this." Alan's gut twisted. Of course Big Boss would keep his hands clean, letting others do his dirty work while he pulled the strings from the shadows. The man was notorious for covering his tracks, for making others dance to his twisted tune. If he was involved, then everything Joseph just told him might be another one of Big Boss's carefully orchestrated setups. "Joseph," Alan said slowly, choosing his words carefully, "if your father was being pushed to the brink, it's possible someone took advantage of his desperation. Smith might have been part of it. But I have reason to believe there's someone else behind the scenes, pulling the strings." Joseph's eyes widened, a spark of fear igniting in them. You think someone forced my father into this? Used him as a pawn?" "It's a possibility," Alan said, his voice steady. "But to confirm that, I need your help. Did your father ever mention any meetings with Big Boss or anyone connected to him? Anything unusual in the days leading up to this?" Joseph looked down, brow furrowed in concentration, as if trying to pull buried memories to the surface. "No, not exactly," he finally said. "But now that you mention it, my father did seem more stressed than usual. He was taking calls at odd hours, and there was one night I heard him arguing with someone over the phone. He wouldn't tell me who it was." Alan's mind whirred, connecting the dots. This could be it, the missing link. Big Boss could have manipulated Smith and Hardy, pitting them against each other, knowing their desperation would eventually lead to bloodshed. But to what end? What did Big Boss stand to gain from this macabre display? Before Alan could press Joseph further, a knock came at the door. Detective Rivera stepped in, her expression tense. "Inspector, you need to see this. We found something in Smith's briefcase, documents that link him to Big Boss, financial records, offshore accounts. It's all here." Alan's pulse quickened. The noose was tightening, and the threads of the case were finally coming together. He turned back to Joseph, who looked like he had just been struck. "Looks like your father and Smith were involved in something deeper than either of us realized," Alan said quietly. Joseph's face paled, his eyes welling up with tears. "You mean, my father was part of whatever Big Boss was planning," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "That's what it looks like," Alan replied, though he wasn't entirely convinced. There were still too many pieces missing, too many shadows where the truth could hide. But one thing was certain. If Big Boss was involved, this was only the beginning. Alan's mind raced as he watched Joseph crumble. He knew that to get to the bottom of this, he would have to outthink Big Boss, stay one step ahead of a man who thrived on chaos. And for that, he would need allies, whether they came willingly or not. "Joseph," Alan said, his voice a low, urgent whisper, "if you want to clear your father's name, you need to help me take down Big Boss. Are you in?" The young man looked up, wiping the tears from his eyes. There was a steely resolve in his gaze now, the fire of vengeance burning brighter than before. "I'm in, Inspector," he said, his voice steady. "For my father—" Alan nodded. The game was afoot, and Big Boss had just made a fatal mistake. He'd given Alan something to fight for. The air in the dimly lit study was thick with tension. Outside, the storm had intensified, rain pelting the windows in relentless sheets, and thunder rumbling in the distance like an ominous warning. Alan stood in the center of the room, his arms crossed, eyes darting between the two young men facing off against each other. Henry Smith, a lean young man in his 20s with piercing blue eyes and a defiant set to his jaw, was practically vibrating with rage. Across from him stood Joseph Hardy, his eyes dark with a mix of grief and fury. "This is on you, Hardy," Henry spat, stepping closer to Joseph, who didn't back down. "Your father was a thief. He exploited my grandfather's invention, used it to line his pockets, and now you've got the nerve to act like a saint." Joseph's face turned red, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "You're full of it, Henry. My father didn't steal anything. If your grandfather was as brilliant as you claim, maybe he should have protected his ideas better. Don't blame my father because yours couldn't keep up." The words hung in the air like jagged glass, ready to shatter at the slightest provocation. Alan watched, his eyes narrowing as he took in every word, every shift in posture. He could feel the anger radiating off both young men, each one convinced of their righteousness. But Alan knew better. Somewhere in their accusations lay the truth he was searching for. "All right, that's enough." Alan's voice cut through the escalating argument, his tone commanding immediate attention. "If you two want to keep throwing accusations, I'll be more than happy to book you both for obstruction. But if you actually want to clear your family's names, you'll sit down and start making sense." Joseph, breathing hard, reluctantly stepped back, while Henry crossed his arms defiantly but remained silent. Alan could see that both of them were close to boiling over, but he couldn't afford to let this turn into a fistfight. Not when they were this close to uncovering the truth. Alan turned to Henry first, fixing him with a sharp gaze. "You're saying Hardy's father exploited your grandfather's invention. What exactly are you talking about?" Henry's lips twisted in a bitter grimace. "My grandfather, Mr. Smith, was a genius," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "He came up with a revolutionary design for a new type of energy converter, something that could have changed the game for renewable energy. He trusted Hardy's father, made him a partner because he thought they shared the same vision. But instead, Hardy took that invention, patented it in his own name, and cut my grandfather out of the profits." "That's a lie!" Joseph burst out, unable to contain himself. "My father never stole anything. He helped your grandfather develop that design, invested his own money into it when no one else would. It was a joint venture, but your grandfather got greedy when it started turning a profit." Henry's face flushed a deeper shade of red. "You're full of it, Hardy. My grandfather was on his deathbed, practically bankrupt because of your father's manipulation. He couldn't afford the legal battle to get back what was rightfully his." As the two young men squared off again, Alan stepped between them, raising his hands to keep them apart. "Stop it, both of you," he commanded. "You can trade insults all night, but it won't change the fact that we have two dead bodies in the next room. Now, unless you want to join them, I suggest you start telling me the truth." There was a tense silence as both Henry and Joseph glared at each other, their hatred simmering just below the surface. Finally, Alan turned to Joseph, his expression softening slightly. "Joseph, did your father ever mention this invention to you? Did he say anything about Smith's accusations before he died?" Joseph hesitated, running a shaky hand through his hair. He mentioned the project once, but it was years ago. He said Smith had agreed to a deal, and then tried to back out when he realized how lucrative it was going to be. My father said it was just business, that Smith couldn't handle the competition. And you believed him?" Henry shot back, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Of course you did. Your father was a saint, wasn't he? Joseph's eyes flashed, and for a moment, Alan thought the younger Hardy might lose control again. But instead, he took a deep breath and shook his head. My father wasn't perfect, but he wasn't a thief, he said, his voice quieter now. He was trying to save our family's business. You have no idea how much pressure he was under. Alan watched the exchange carefully, filing away every piece of information. It was clear that whatever bad blood existed between these families ran deep, far beyond the deaths of Smith and Hardy. But what he couldn't figure out was how this bitter feud had culminated in murder. Let me ask you both something, Alan said, his voice calm but insistent. If your fathers were at each other's throats over this invention, why were they found dead together in the same room? What brought them to this mansion tonight? Neither Henry nor Joseph seemed to have an answer. They looked at each other, and for a brief moment, the anger in their eyes was replaced by confusion. It was as if they were realizing for the first time that they had no idea what their fathers had been up to in the hours leading up to their deaths. Henry was the first to break the silence. I don't know, he admitted reluctantly, but I do know that my grandfather was still trying to reclaim that patent until the day he died. He said he had evidence that Hardy's father had forged some of the original documents. Maybe he came here tonight to confront him with it. That's ridiculous, Joseph retorted, though there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. If my father had something to hide, why would he have agreed to meet here? Why not just bury it? Alan nodded thoughtfully. The pieces still weren't fitting together, but he could feel that he was getting closer. And what about you, Henry? Did your grandfather leave behind any evidence of the supposed forgery? Henry's face turned stony. If he did, I haven't found it, but I know it exists. He kept talking about a secret safe, somewhere no one would think to look. That's why I came here tonight. I thought maybe he hid it in one of the places he and Hardy used to meet. Alan's mind raced. A secret safe, hidden evidence. This could change everything. If Smith had been hiding proof of Hardy's betrayal, that might explain why both men had ended up dead. But who had found out about it? And more importantly, who had been willing to kill to keep it buried? Listen, Alan said, his tone urgent. If there's a safe or hidden documents that could explain what happened, I need to find it. But I can't do that if you two keep trying to rip each other's throats out. If your families are tied up in this, we need to unravel it together. Joseph and Henry exchanged a reluctant look. The hatred between them hadn't vanished, but it had cooled to a simmer. Alan could see that they were both torn between their distrust of each other and their desire for the truth. All right, Henry said grudgingly. I'll help, but only because I want to clear my grandfather's name. Same here, Joseph agreed, though his eyes were still hard as he looked at Henry. I'm not letting you drag my father's name through the mud without proof. Good, Alan said, nodding. Then let's get to work, because I have a feeling we're running out of time. And if Big Boss is involved, he's not going to wait around for us to figure it out. The storm outside seemed to intensify as if in response to Alan's words, the wind howling like a vengeful spirit. Somewhere deep within the mansion, a clock struck midnight, its chimes echoing ominously. Alan couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the edge of a precipice, and whatever they were about to uncover would change everything. The storm outside had reached a furious crescendo, lightning slashing across the sky as the mansion seemed to shudder under the weight of the howling wind. Inside, the air was tense, charged with the energy of too many secrets lurking in the shadows. Alan was in the middle of questioning Henry and Joseph, trying to make sense of the tangled accusations they were hurling at each other, when he noticed something odd. "Where's Dr. Sam?" Alan suddenly asked, his voice cutting through the heated argument. Everyone in the room turned to look around, realizing at once that the chief medical examiner was nowhere to be seen. He had been standing just a few feet away moments ago, scribbling notes in his ever-present leather-bound journal. Now, it was as if he had vanished into thin air. Maybe he went to check on something, Detective Rivera suggested, though there was a slight furrow in her brow. But he wouldn't just leave without saying anything. He's too professional for that. Alan's gut twisted. Something wasn't right. "I'll find him," he muttered. grabbing his flashlight and heading toward the dark hallway that led out of the study. He paused only to glance back at Rivera. "Keep an eye on these two," he instructed. Nodding toward Henry and Joseph, who were glaring daggers at each other. The mansion was a maze of narrow corridors and creaking floors, its ancient bones groaning under the assault of the storm. As Alan made his way down the dimly lit halls, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The shadows seemed to ripple and shift with every flicker of the lightning, making his pulse quicken. "Dr. Sam?" Alan called out, his voice swallowed by the sound of rain hammering against the windows. But there was no response, just the eerie silence that seemed to seep into the very walls of the mansion. He turned a corner, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, when he noticed something on the floor, drops of crimson glistening on the old wooden planks. Blood. His heart pounded as he quickened his pace, following the trail that led to the back entrance of the mansion. The door was slightly ajar, swaying with the gusts of wind. "Damn it," Alan muttered under his breath. He pushed the door open and stepped out into the storm. The cold wind hit him like a slap, rain soaking him instantly. He scanned the overgrown gardens that surrounded the mansion, his flashlight catching glimpses of twisted branches and rusted statues. Then he saw it, a dark shape slumped against the wrought iron gate at the far end of the property. Alan's stomach dropped. He sprinted across the muddy ground, his feet slipping in the wet grass, and as he drew closer, his worst fears were confirmed. Dr. Sam was sitting upright against the gate, his eyes wide open, staring blankly into the stormy night. A deep purple bruise encircled his neck like a grotesque necklace. He had been strangled. "Damn it," Alan cursed again, kneeling beside the lifeless body. The man's journal was missing, and Alan's instinct screamed that this was no random attack. Someone had wanted Dr. Sam's silence, and quickly. Rivera came running up behind him, panting from exertion. She froze when she saw Dr. Sam's corpse, her eyes widening in horror. "Oh, God! What happened?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Someone didn't want him talking," Alan replied grimly. He stood up, his mind racing. He must have discovered something they couldn't risk him revealing. Rivera nodded slowly, piecing it together. He was taking notes on the scene earlier. "Do you think he found something that could blow this case wide open?" "More than likely," Alan said, his eyes scanning the darkened grounds, searching for any sign of the killer. But there was nothing, just the relentless rain pounding down on them, erasing any potential evidence. "We need to find that journal," he added, turning back to Rivera. "If he wrote down whatever he discovered, it might still be our key to cracking this case." As they hurried back toward the mansion, Alan couldn't shake the image of Dr. Sam's lifeless eyes staring up at him. The man had been thorough, meticulous, the type who didn't miss a detail. If he had found something, it was bound to be crucial. But now the question was, what had he uncovered, and who had killed him to keep it hidden? Back inside, the atmosphere was even tenser. Henry and Joseph were still in the study, but now they were silent, exchanging wary glances. They both turned to Alan as he re-entered, dripping water onto the expensive rug. "What happened?" Joseph asked, his voice tinged with apprehension. "Dr. Sam is dead," Alan said flatly, watching their reactions closely. Henry's eyes widened in genuine shock, while Joseph's mouth fell open. "Strangled outside the mansion. Whoever killed him took his journal. Why would someone kill the chief medical examiner?" Henry stammered, looking genuinely confused. What could he have possibly known? "That's what I intend to find out," Alan said, fixing them both with a piercing stare. "But the two of you might know more than you're letting on. If Dr. Sam found something that implicated one of your families, now's the time to come clean." Joseph shook his head, his eyes wide with panic. "I don't know anything. I swear. I just want to clear my father's name." Henry, however, seemed to hesitate, his gaze flickering toward the window, as if he was trying to decide whether to flee or confess something. Alan caught the hesitation, his instincts kicking in. "Henry, if there's something you're not telling me, now's your chance. If you don't, and I find out you had anything to do with this, I won't hesitate to put you in cuffs." Henry swallowed hard, his atoms apple-bobbing. "Look, I don't know about Dr. Sam, okay? But I overheard my grandfather talking about some kind of insurance policy. He said he had something that would protect him if Hardy tried to double-cross him again. I thought he was just being paranoid. But maybe that's what Dr. Sam found." Alan's eyes narrowed. "Insurance policy? What kind of insurance policy?" Henry shrugged, looking genuinely lost. "I don't know. He never told me. But if Dr. Sam found whatever it was, then that's why he's dead now." Alan turned to Rivera. "We need to search this place top to bottom. If Smith had hidden something, a document or some evidence, it's the reason people are getting killed." But even as he spoke, Alan knew they were racing against time. The killer had already silenced Dr. Sam, and if they were willing to kill again to keep their secrets buried, Alan's team could be next. As the storm outside raged on, it felt as though the mansion itself was a living entity, full of dark secrets waiting to swallow them whole. "Everyone stays in this house," Alan ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos. "No one leaves until we find out what's really going on here. Because the killer is still among us, and I'm not letting anyone else die tonight." As Alan's words hung in the air, a sudden crash echoed from somewhere deep within the mansion, sending a chill down everyone's spine. The storm had brought something far darker than rain and thunder to their doorstep, and Alan was determined to uncover it before it claimed its next victim. The storm outside continued its relentless assault on the old mansion, sheets of rain drumming against the windows and flashes of lightning casting eerie, fleeting shadows across the walls. Alan stood alone in the study, deep in thought, trying to fit together the jagged pieces of the puzzle that lay scattered in his mind. Dr. Sam's murder had escalated everything. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to hide the truth. They were willing to kill to ensure it stayed buried. Alan's eyes drifted to the chaotic remnants of the crime scene. The room was filled with half-empty glasses, chairs that had been pushed aside, and the thick scent of cigar smoke still lingering in the air. It was as if whatever had transpired here had left an invisible residue, a lingering tension that refused to dissipate. He turned, scanning the area once more. His gaze settled on a side table near the corner, cluttered with papers, a glass decanter, and a scattering of objects that looked as if they had been hastily shoved aside. But what caught Alan's eye was a small brown bottle, almost hidden behind a stack of correspondence. "What's this?" he muttered to himself, reaching for it. He picked up the bottle, turning it over in his hands. The label was worn, but still legible. Diazepam, prescribed to William Hardy. The sight of the medication bottle sent a spark through Alan's mind, a thread of suspicion beginning to weave itself into the larger tapestry of the case. Just then, Sub-Inspector Fred entered the room, his wet boots squelching on the floor. "You called, sir?" he asked, taking in the scene with his usual calm efficiency. "Take a look at this," Alan said, holding out the bottle. "It's Hardy's medication. Diazepam. Likely prescribed to control anxiety or some sort of nervous condition." Fred frowned, adjusting his glasses to read the label. Strange to leave something like this lying around in the middle of, well, whatever went down here. "Exactly," Alan agreed. "And it got me thinking. If Hardy was on medication, then it's possible that whoever orchestrated this used his schedule against him." Fred raised an eyebrow. "You think his medication was tied to the timing of his death?" Alan nodded, pacing as he spoke, the gears in his mind turning faster. "Consider this. Hardy was found shot alongside Smith. Both men had gunpowder residue on their hands, which suggested they might have fired shots. But what if Hardy wasn't in his right state of mind when it happened? What if his medication played a role?" Fred looked intrigued now. "You're thinking someone tampered with his medication? Or perhaps timed the confrontation to occur where he was in a vulnerable state?" "That's exactly it," Alan replied. He set the bottle down on the desk and opened one of Hardy's medical files that Dr. Sam had left behind before his untimely demise. Look here. Hardy was supposed to take his medication 3 times a day, morning, afternoon, and late evening. Fred leaned in, squinting at the file. So if Hardy missed a dose, or if someone made sure he did, Alan added, his voice growing more intense. If Hardy's anxiety meds were withheld or tampered with, it could have left him agitated, paranoid, maybe even unstable enough to act impulsively. Fred nodded slowly, the pieces beginning to fall into place. That would certainly explain why he might have gotten into a confrontation with Smith, but it still doesn't explain the murder-suicide angle Dr. Sam was initially leaning toward. Alan's eyes darkened at the mention of Dr. Sam. I don't think it was a murder-suicide at all. I think it was staged to look that way. And whatever Dr. Sam found out before he was killed, it was enough to make the real killer nervous. Just as Alan was contemplating this new angle, Detective Rivera walked in, her face set with grim determination. "Sir, we've been combing through Hardy's belongings," she reported. "There's something you might want to see." Alan and Fred followed her into the adjoining room, where the rest of the team had laid out Hardy's personal effects. Among the papers, business contracts, and legal documents, Rivera pointed to another small bottle, similar to the one Alan had found earlier. "This one's empty," she said, holding it up. "It's the same medication, diazepam, but the dosage is different. It's much stronger." Alan's eyes narrowed as he examined the empty bottle. This doesn't make sense. If Hardy was already taking a regular dose, why would he have a second, stronger prescription? Rivera shrugged. Maybe he was self-medicating? Or someone was trying to make sure he was more docile. Alan shook his head. Or less in control, he said slowly. Someone could have been messing with his dosage, making sure he was either too sedated to think straight or not taking enough to keep his nerves under control. Either way, it's the perfect setup if you want someone to appear unstable. Fred's eyes widened as the realization dawned on him. "You mean someone was manipulating Hardy, setting him up to appear like he lost his mind and killed Smith?" Alan nodded. "That's my theory. And if Hardy was in a haze, either from a sudden overdose or from withdrawal, he could have been easily provoked into a deadly confrontation. Someone knew exactly how to use Hardy's vulnerabilities against him. But why kill Smith too?" Rivera asked, puzzled. If Hardy was a target, why not just let him self-destruct? Alan ran a hand through his hair, his thoughts churning. Maybe Smith found out about the manipulation. Maybe he came here tonight to confront Hardy, not knowing that Hardy was already on the edge. And when the real culprit saw things spiraling out of control, Fred said, picking up the thread, they killed both of them to cover their tracks. A sudden thought struck Alan. We need to find out who had access to Hardy's medication. His doctor, his house staff, maybe even Dr. Sam. If Sam figured out that someone was playing with Hardy's prescriptions, that could be why he ended up dead. Rivera's eyes widened. "I'll get on it, sir. We'll check with the pharmacy and see if there are any irregularities in Hardy's prescription records." As Rivera hurried off to make the necessary calls, Alan turned back to Fred. "Something tells me we're missing a piece of the puzzle here. Whoever is behind this is meticulous, calculating. They planned this entire setup, knowing exactly how to manipulate Hardy and Smith into that deadly confrontation." Fred sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "You think it's Big Boss, don't you? That this whole thing is another one of his schemes to discredit you?" "It's possible," Alan admitted, his jaw tightening. "Big Boss has been trying to take me down for years. And what better way to do it than to set me up to fail on a high-profile case like this? But if he's involved, he's more careful than ever. We're not dealing with someone who's sloppy." The wind outside howled, rattling the window panes, as if the storm itself was urging Alan to move faster. He couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Every second they wasted brought the killer closer to slipping through their grasp. "Come on," Alan said, grabbing his coat. "We need to search Hardy's study again. If there's any evidence that connects Big Boss or anyone else to this, it's going to be there. And we'd better find it before the storm swallows up any trace of what really happened here. Fred nodded, and together they hurried back down the twisting hallways of the old mansion, their footsteps echoing in the darkness. They were running out of time, and Alan knew the next move they made could be the difference between solving this case or becoming the next victims in a game where the stakes kept getting deadlier. The storm outside the mansion raged on, a relentless force that matched the chaos unfolding inside. Alan stood at the center of the dimly lit study, the flickering candlelight casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. He was exhausted, his mind spinning as he tried to make sense of the ever-growing list of clues. But something was beginning to click. Like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle falling into place, a dark realization began to dawn on him. Sub-Inspector Fred was pacing the room, trying to shake off the fatigue that clung to them all like a heavy shroud. "This case doesn't add up," Fred muttered, shaking his head. 2 men dead, both with gunpowder residue on their hands, and yet something just feels off. "It's more than just off, Fred," Alan said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "I think we've been looking at this all wrong." Fred stopped pacing, turning to Alan with a raised eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Alan took a deep breath, the weight of his realization settling over him. "It's not a double murder. It was never meant to look that way." Fred frowned, confusion etched on his face. "But we found 2 bodies, both shot in the head. Dr. Sem thought it might have been a murder-suicide, but we dismissed that. Are you saying he was right?" Alan nodded slowly, his eyes narrowed in thought. "Yes, but not in the way we initially believed." He turned toward the window, where rain lashed against the glass, creating a staccato rhythm that mirrored his racing thoughts. "Smith shot Hardy," he said, his voice steady, each word carrying the weight of certainty. "What?" Fred's eyes widened in disbelief. But why would Smith kill Hardy? They were supposed to be business partners. Business partners, yes, Alan agreed, but also rivals, driven by greed and betrayal. Smith blamed Hardy for exploiting his grandfather's invention, pushing him to the brink of financial ruin. But when Smith pulled that trigger, Alan paused, the pieces of the story unfolding in his mind. He was overcome with guilt. It wasn't just rage that drove him. I think, deep down, he regretted it immediately. Fred's face paled as the implications hit him. "So, Smith killed Hardy, then out of guilt." Alan nodded. He turned the gun on himself. A murder born out of desperation, followed by the immediate, crushing weight of remorse. But that's where the story should have ended. If it weren't for Henry. "Henry?" Fred asked, a deep frown etched on his face. "What does he have to do with this?" Alan gestured for Fred to follow him to the corner of the room where the pistol had been discovered earlier. "Henry tampered with the crime scene," Alan explained. "He reloaded the pistol after Smith killed himself, trying to throw us off track." Fred blinked in disbelief. Why the hell would he do that? Alan turned to face Fred, his expression grim. To confuse the investigation. Henry wanted to obscure what really happened here tonight. To keep the waters muddied so no one could figure out the truth. Maybe he thought he was protecting his family's reputation. Or maybe he had something to gain from making this case unsolvable. Just then, a sound echoed from the hallway. A faint creak of a floorboard. The unmistakable sound of someone trying to move stealthily. Alan's head snapped toward the door, his instincts flaring. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Fred nodded, already reaching for his sidearm. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice low and urgent. They crept toward the doorway, their footsteps soft on the worn carpet. Alan's heart pounded as they moved deeper into the mansion's maze-like corridors. The storm outside seemed to grow louder, almost as if it were trying to drown out the secrets hidden within these walls. As they turned a corner, they spotted a figure huddled in the shadows, their back turned. The dim light from Alan's flashlight fell upon the figure's trembling hands, which were stained with the unmistakable dark smear of gunpowder residue. "Henry!" Alan barked, his voice a sharp command that cut through the howling wind. Henry spun around, his face pale and his eyes wild with fear. For a moment, he looked like a cornered animal, ready to lash out or flee. But then his shoulders slumped, and he seemed to deflate, as if the fight had finally left him. "What do you want?" Henry spat, his voice breaking with a mixture of defiance and desperation. "I didn't do anything wrong." "Didn't do anything wrong?" Fred said, stepping forward. "We know you tampered with the crime scene. You reloaded that pistol to make it look like there was a struggle, to confuse us." Henry's eyes darted between Alan and Fred, panic rising in them. "You don't understand," he stammered. I was just trying to protect my grandfather's legacy." "Protect his legacy?" Alan asked, his tone deceptively calm. "By tampering with evidence and covering up the truth? Tell me, Henry, what were you really trying to achieve?" Henry hesitated, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Finally, he seemed to crumble, his knees buckling as he sank to the floor. I thought if I could just make it look confusing, you'd never be able to figure it out," he confessed, tears streaming down his face. "My grandfather, he was trying to protect me. He said Hardy was planning to ruin us, to take everything." "So you reloaded the gun," Alan said, his voice steady but cold, "hoping it would throw us off, hoping we'd think there was a third party involved." Henry nodded, his sobs growing louder. "Yes, I just wanted to buy time. I thought maybe if I could just mess with the evidence, you'd never be able to figure out who was really to blame." Alan crouched down to meet Henry's eyes. "But it was too late, wasn't it? Smith killed Hardy, then realized what he'd done and couldn't live with himself. You couldn't change that." Henry's face crumpled, his sobs turning into broken gasps. I didn't want it all to end like this. My grandfather lost everything because of Hardy, and then Smith, he just snapped. I thought I could fix it, but I've only made things worse." Fred stepped forward, his voice softer now, almost gentle. "Henry, listen to me. Tampering with a crime scene is serious, but right now, we need to know the truth. Who else was involved? Did someone put pressure on Smith to confront Hardy?" Henry shook his head, tears still streaming down his face. "No, it was just them. My grandfather and Hardy. They had been fighting for years. Smith finally snapped tonight, but no one else was involved." Alan stood up, exchanging a look with Fred. "We'll need you to come with us, Henry," he said, his voice carrying the weight of the law. "You've tampered with evidence, and that's a crime in itself. But maybe, just maybe, you can help us uncover the rest of the truth." As they escorted Henry back to the study, Alan couldn't help but feel the weight of the storm pressing down on him. This case was far from over. Dr. Sam's murder, the manipulation of Hardy's medication, and the interference from his old rival Big Boss, all of it was still hanging over them like a dark cloud. But for now, at least, one part of the mystery was starting to unravel. Alan's mind raced with what lay ahead. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside the mansion, the real storm had only just begun. There were still secrets buried in these walls, and Alan was determined to uncover every last one of them before the night was through. The storm outside seemed to have reached its peak, with the wind howling like a wounded beast, and the rain pelting the mansion's windows in a relentless assault. Inside, however, an even fiercer storm was brewing. Alan's eyes were locked onto Henry, who stood by the fireplace, his back turned to the detective. The flickering flames cast distorted shadows on the walls, making Henry's figure appear as if it were swaying with guilt. The room was filled with a tense, suffocating silence, broken only by the occasional rumble of thunder in the distance. Alan took a slow, deliberate step forward, his eyes never leaving Henry. "You've been lying to me, Henry," Alan said, his voice calm but carrying an edge sharp enough to cut through the tension. "You tampered with the evidence, didn't you? You reloaded that pistol to throw us off." Henry stiffened, his hands curling into fists at his sides. He didn't turn around, didn't even acknowledge Alan's words. For a moment, it seemed like he might deny it, continue the charade. But Alan could see the truth in the young man's hunched shoulders, in the way his fingers trembled slightly. There was no point in denying it any longer. "Why, Henry?" Alan pressed, stepping closer, his voice rising just enough to cut through the crackle of the fire. "You tried to alter the crime scene, to confuse the investigation. You thought you could hide the truth from me, but you failed." Henry finally turned, his face pale and slick with sweat, his eyes wide with something between fear and defiance. "You don't understand," he said, his voice cracking. "I had no choice. I was trying to protect my family." Alan's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing. "Protect them from what? From the truth? Or from the consequences of your grandfather's actions?" Henry shook his head frantically, stepping back as if Alan's words were physical blows. "No, you got it all wrong. My grandfather was... He was desperate. Hardy was squeezing him dry. That man ruined us. Pushed my grandfather to the edge. I thought if I could just buy some time." "By tampering with evidence?" Alan snapped, taking another step forward, his gaze never wavering. "You think you can play with the facts and just walk away unscathed? This isn't some game, Henry. People are dead." Henry's eyes flashed with something close to desperation, his breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. I just thought. I didn't know what else to do," he stammered, his voice rising. "Smith killed Hardy, and then he turned the gun on himself. But if people found out why, if they knew how bad things had gotten between them, it would destroy my family. I had to protect what little we had left." Alan's jaw clenched, his patience thinning. "So you tampered with the scene, reloaded the gun to make it look like there was a third shooter, hoping to create just enough doubt to confuse us." Henry's silence was all the confirmation Alan needed. The young man's shoulders sagged, and he looked as if he might collapse under the weight of his own guilt. But then, without warning, Henry's eyes darted toward the door, calculating the distance, weighing his chances. Before Alan could react, Henry bolted, his feet pounding against the wooden floor as he sprinted toward the hallway. Alan's heart leaped into his throat. "Henry, stop!" he shouted, drawing his gun in one fluid motion. The weight of the firearm felt solid and cold in his hand, a grim reminder of the consequences of desperation. Henry didn't stop. His breath came in ragged gasps as he ran, the sound of his footsteps echoing through the dark corridors of the mansion. Alan took off after him, his mind racing. He couldn't let Henry get away, not now, not with everything that was at stake. The hallways of the mansion were a labyrinth of shadow and flickering light, the old electric fixtures swaying slightly as the storm raged outside. Alan's boots thudded against the floorboards, his gun held steady as he rounded a corner and caught sight of Henry's retreating figure. "Henry," I said, "stop." Alan's voice was a roar that cut through the chaos, but the young man only ran faster, driven by fear and adrenaline. Alan's eyes narrowed. He was out of patience. In one swift motion, Alan raised his gun and fired a warning shot into the ceiling. The deafening crack of the gunshot reverberated through the hallway, making Henry stumble and fall to the ground with a cry. The young man lay there, panting, his eyes wide with terror as Alan closed the distance between them. Alan kept his gun trained on Henry, his voice low and dangerous. "That was a warning. The next one won't be." Henry's eyes filled with tears, his body trembling. Please don't shoot," he whimpered, his voice barely audible over the storm. I just wanted to protect my family. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone." Alan's gaze was icy, his fingers steady on the trigger. "Protecting your family doesn't involve tampering with evidence or obstructing justice. People are dead, Henry. This isn't just some mistake you can sweep under the rug." Henry's shoulders sagged, his spirit finally broken. I just wanted to fix it," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "After I found out what my grandfather had done, I was terrified. I thought if I could just confuse the investigation, maybe no one would dig too deep. I didn't know what else to do." Alan slowly lowered his gun, keeping a wary eye on Henry. Tampering with a crime scene, running from the law. Those aren't the actions of someone trying to fix things. Those are the actions of someone who's scared, who's desperate. Henry nodded, tears streaming down his face. Yes, I was scared. I knew what Smith did was wrong, but he was my grandfather. He was all I had left. I didn't want to lose everything. Not again. Alan's expression softened just a fraction, seeing the broken young man in front of him, but he couldn't let sympathy cloud his judgment. Henry, you've made things worse for yourself, but it's not too late to come clean. If you cooperate, if you tell me everything you know, it might not be too late to salvage some of this. Henry looked up at Alan, his eyes bloodshot and red-rimmed. For a moment, it seemed like he might refuse, might try to make one last desperate attempt to flee. But then he slumped forward, his strength finally giving out. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay, I'll tell you everything." Alan holstered his gun, keeping a watchful eye on Henry as he helped him to his feet. "You'd better," Alan said, his voice cold but not without a hint of understanding. "Because if you try to run again, I won't hesitate next time." Together, they made their way back through the dark, winding hallways, the storm still howling outside. Alan could feel the weight of the mansion pressing down on him, the secrets within its walls heavy and suffocating. But for the first time in hours, he felt a small sliver of hope. Henry's confession was a step forward, but there were still too many questions left unanswered, too many pieces that didn't quite fit. As they approached the study once more, Alan glanced at Henry. "This is just the beginning," he said. "There's more to this case than you realize. And if you're truly willing to cooperate, you're going to help me find the truth, no matter how deep we have to dig." Henry nodded, a haunted look in his eyes. "I don't have anything left to lose," he said softly. "Good," Alan replied, his voice as steady as the storm raging outside. "Because that's exactly what it's going to take to get to the bottom of this." The storm outside had finally calmed, its fury now a soft murmur in the distance. The mansion, once full of tension and dark secrets, stood quiet, almost too quiet, as Alan sat in the study, staring at the evidence before him. It had taken all his skill, all his experience, and every ounce of his determination, but the pieces had finally fallen into place. Alan leaned forward, his fingers drumming on the edge of the table as he reviewed the final details in his mind. Smith had killed Hardy, that much was clear. The gunpowder residue on both men's hands had been the first clue, a sign of desperation, a sign of guilt. Smith, the older man, had shot Hardy in a burst of rage. It wasn't a planned murder, but a breaking point. The final straw in years of financial ruin, betrayal, and personal animosity. But then, after pulling the trigger, Smith had been overwhelmed with remorse. He couldn't live with what he'd done. Alan closed his eyes for a moment, picturing Smith's face when he'd made that decision, when the guilt took hold, when he had turned the gun on himself. He'd wanted to make it all end, to escape the burden of his actions. And yet, in his final moments, Smith had made one fatal error. In his haste to end his life, he'd reloaded the gun, leaving behind a trail of confusion for anyone who might later examine the scene. But Henry's tampering had only further obscured the truth. As Alan stared at the pistol resting on the desk, it became clearer than ever. Smith had committed murder and then, in his guilt, had turned the weapon on himself. It had all made sense in the end. The final piece of the puzzle had come from Henry's confession. The young man had been driven by fear, by the need to protect his family's name, and by a misguided sense of duty to his late grandfather. Henry had hoped to shield his family from the public fallout, thinking that if he muddied the waters, no one would discover the truth. But now, with the full story revealed, it was no longer a question of what had happened. It was about setting the record straight. Alan stood up, his body stiff from hours of contemplation. He could hear the soft creak of the mansion's floorboards beneath his feet as he made his way to the door. The weight of the case had been heavy on his shoulders, but now, at last, there was a sense of closure. He found Fred in the hallway, leaning against the wall, his arms folded across his chest. "I think we've got it," Alan said, his voice steady, his eyes unwavering. Fred raised an eyebrow. "You mean it's over?" Alan nodded, his gaze hardening as he walked past Fred. "Smith killed Hardy first, then shot himself out of guilt. It's clear now. There's no one else involved." Fred let out a breath, clearly relieved. "You did it, Alan. You solved the case." Alan nodded, but his mind was already turning to the bigger picture, the toll this case had taken on him. His reputation had been on the line, his career teetering dangerously close to ruin after his old rival, Big Boss, had done everything he could to discredit him. But now, Alan had proven his worth, restored his credibility, and solved a case that had seemed impossible to crack. As he stepped outside, the cool night air hit his face, a welcome contrast to the stifling atmosphere of the mansion. He looked up at the sky, the first stars now emerging from behind the clouds. The storm had passed, and so had the storm within him. Alan had proven himself, both to those around him and, more importantly, to himself. With a final deep breath, Alan turned and walked away from the mansion, his mind at peace. The weight of the mystery finally lifted. The case was closed,